We really do need to be thinking creatively about how we support small-scale producers in developing countries, and especially in Africa, in developing a new model of agriculture that will be ecologically sound, but also providing meaningful livelihoods.
Hello, this is the Weekly Tradecast, a podcast brought to you by UN Trade and Development. I'm Sarah Toms. We're exploring how major events are shaping trade and development and how that affects billions of people around the world. This week, with special guest political economist Jennifer Clapp, we're looking at the global trade in food and why developing countries must move up the value chain to help drive the sustainability of what we eat. Crises, conflicts and climate change are all affecting how and where our food is grown, processed and shipped. At the same time, the global food system is dominated by a few huge companies that shape policies, trade and development. So how can we protect the environment and our supplies of food? And how can the Global South play a bigger role in supply chains and in a sustainable food future? Well, here now for more is Jennifer Clapp, a professor at the University of Waterloo and Canada Research Chair in Global Food Security and Sustainability. Jennifer is also a member of the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems, EPIS. The views in this podcast are those of the guests. Welcome to the show, Jennifer. It's so great to have you on today. To start with, what would you say is the state of the food trade right now, and why is it not serving the world as well as it should be?
Well, it's a great question, because actually today, around a quarter of the world's food production crosses a border, so it's traded. And that's actually a higher percentage than was the case several decades ago. What's interesting is that as we're seeing more and more of the world's food production being traded around the world, it's becoming increasingly clear that this global food trade isn't always serving everyone as well as it should. And that's in part because the system does embody several levels of concentration within that trade, and that tends to generate some inequities that result in some uneven outcomes. So one of those levels is with respect to the crops that are traded, the food that's traded around the world. And in particular, I'm really fascinated with staple crops trade, because this trade of, say, for example, rice, soy, wheat, and maize, these are the main staple crops that are traded globally. And these four crops alone comprise around 2/3 of human diets. And in the time that we've increasingly been trading these crops around the world, we've tended to lose dietary diversity because we're relying on just a few crops. So if something happens to any one of those crops, if there's a production shortfall because of disease or climate change, et cetera, this can wreak havoc on world markets. And each of those four crops have just, 5 to 7 countries that are the main exporters. So again, if anything happens to any one of those main countries that are exporting those four crops, it can cause havoc. And that happened when Russia invaded Ukraine. And because Russia and Ukraine were big producers of wheat and maize, those markets went bananas with higher food prices, et cetera. And then we also have concentrated corporations. So the trade in these concentrated staple crops is actually concentrated in the hands of a very few large trading and grain handling companies that have extraordinary market power. And this market power was outlined in a recent UNCTAD report, which was really great because it showed that these markets are really financialized and the actors that dominate have profited handsomely through food crises. So a lot of other countries actually end up being dependent on imports from just a few countries. And that's especially the case in some parts of the world like sub-Saharan Africa. And it's hard for those countries increasingly to be relying on these global markets because they are the countries that are most affected by the global debt burden right now, and also they're facing high levels of food insecurity. So it's created an inequitable situation. And, we have to remember, of course, many developing countries are exporting commodities into the global market as well, into these global value chains. So, for example, cocoa, coffee, palm oil, bananas, there is this ability of those countries to specialize and trade these global commodities that are important for the global food system, but we have to remember those markets are also concentrated and many times controlled by those corporations that tend to reap the profits, perhaps more than the smallholder producers that are producing those crops.
From what you've said, Jennifer, with so many challenges, you've got conflicts, you've got climate change, you've got monopolies, are any food crops at threat?
Yeah, I think we do need to bring more diversity back into food systems because we're relying so heavily on so few crops. And around 75% of global agrobiodiversity has been lost in the past century. So when I'm thinking about diversification, I'm thinking about diversity of the crops that we grow and also diversity of how we grow them, and then diversity in terms of how that food is distributed. So there have been some growing calls in recent years to implement this kind of diversification of food supplies through more territorial markets. And what that means is markets that are focused more on regional and local trade. Territorial markets actually, they exist already in many parts of the world. And in fact, they provide foodstuffs for around 70% of the world's population. And that's mainly in developing countries where many people rely on these local and regional markets for their food security. They provide diverse livelihoods for millions of small-scale producers, for traders, and food processors that are working at more of that local and regional level. And territorial markets have been increasingly recognized, especially in the pandemic, for being important for reducing volatility in global
Right,
markets. So
right.
when we saw supply chains disrupted, the global supply chains, there were still local supply chains and local markets that were able to provide food. The problem is that territorial markets right now they're under threat. They're being held back by the growing power of the large and concentrated firms and also by the growing import dependence in many developing countries. So it's important to support territorial markets, and again, in developing countries, but also in rich industrialized countries around the world. We're thinking farmers markets and other kinds of regional cooperative markets that are important. And it's important for policies to change to provide that support. So, for example, shifting subsidies away from the large industrial producers and traders and towards the smaller scale producers, but also the provision of infrastructure. That's one of the biggest challenges for territorial markets. So it's important to provide that infrastructure for safe and sanitary food to be traded at that local and regional level. So that diversification of having multiple kinds of markets that we get our food from, I think, is one of the best risk management approaches, especially in this era of geopolitical change and also climate change.
Well, you mentioned geopolitical risk. I mean, how do we build in more food security and resilience? And can we protect the environment, feed the world, and create a more sustainable future all at the same time?
Yeah, it is a really big ask. So trade is really important for food access. But when we think about resilient food security, we also have to think about how food is produced. In other words, whether it's produced sustainably. We have to think about how much food is produced. Is there enough for everyone? We have to think about people's agency and participation in food systems. And also we have to think about the quality of diets. In other words, nutrition, and the stability of food system in the face of these shocks. So there's a lot of moving parts here, and there's a lot going on. There are aspects that have been missed in the past, and why we've been missing our targets in terms of SDG 2, reducing hunger. We've got nearly 800 million people on the planet who don't have enough to eat, and that has gotten worse in the pandemic, and we haven't recovered yet. Even though food prices have come down, we still have high levels of food insecurity. And so thinking about these other elements like agency and sustainability is really helpful, because as the climate is changing and we're seeing more and more of an ecological crisis, we have to think about that ability of food systems to provide food security into the long future. And we also have to recognize that people really do need to be involved in the organizing food systems in ways that suit their, cultural needs, their food preferences, but also their livelihoods. The idea is using agricultural practices based on ecological scientific principles that can reduce the kind of inputs used in agriculture that is contributing to some of the problems we're seeing, like climate change. There's a ton of fossil fuel use, for example, on farms to fuel farm machinery, to make the fertilizers itself. It uses a lot of natural gas. There's a lot of plastics that are used on farms. Pesticides are based on petrochemical products. So if we can cut those fossil fuel using elements out of the farm production process, we can actually reduce climate emissions. And this process also helps to build carbon in soils. So the production method, I think, is really important. But what's really interesting to me about agroecology, and the advocates really make clear, it's not just a science and it's not just a practice in fields, but it's also a social movement that is part of a broader food sovereignty movement that's calling for more equitable participation in shaping food systems. And because it's more resilient to climate change, it can help create more stability.
That's the crux, isn't it? I mean, how can developing countries move up the value chain? What would you say your take is on the role of the global south in the future of food?
I think the global south really needs to play a very big role in the future of food. We know that food systems provide livelihoods for over a third of humanity, and most of those agricultural producers in the world, there's 500 million small scale farmers, and they're mostly in the developing world because industrial agriculture has taken hold in much of the rich industrialized world. And in many rich industrialized countries, like in North America, 1% to 2% of the population is engaged in farming, for example. But if you look at many developing countries, it's more like 40, 50%, and in some cases higher. And so it's vital that the global south and sub-Saharan Africa in particular plays a leading role in the future of food. And I think we have to kind of break away from this assumption that all countries are eventually going to become large-scale industrial farming countries. And it's just not possible in some parts of the world. And so we really do need to be thinking creatively about how we support small-scale producers in developing countries, and especially in Africa, to be the future, take the lead in developing a new model of agriculture that will be ecologically sound, reducing that ecological footprint, but also providing meaningful livelihoods for small-scale producers. I don't know that those ag exporting regions of the world can also sustain that model for much longer either. So I think this conversation about the future of food really has to be a global one, and we have to think about the transformation of food systems. The 2021 UN Food System Summit was about this really big question. And of course, there are lots of vested interests that would like to see a continuation of that system. So if we're going to move towards another model, we have to think in the long term, but also we have to recognize we don't have a lot of time because of the climate crisis. The ecological crisis is so upon us and urgent. So we have to be deliberate and careful in how we think about moving forward because we don't have a lot of time to lose.
Well, great. It's a very complex issue for the one thing that we can't do without, food.
Exactly.
Thank you, Jennifer. That was Jennifer Clapp, political economist from the University of Waterloo. Tune into the Weekly Tradecast next week and every week for more insights on the most pressing issues around the world of trade and development. There's even more on our website, unctad.org. I'm Sarah Toms in Geneva. Goodbye for now.